It was a busy morning at the airport. People were rushing from one gate to another, dragging their suitcases, holding coffee cups, and glancing nervously at the screens that showed flight times. Among the noise and movement, a young girl stood quietly near gate 27, holding a small pink backpack and a teddy bear that looked a little worn from years of love. She didn't seem nervous, just calm, almost too calm for someone her age. She wore a neat blue sweater and jeans, her hair tied in two small braids. Her eyes were curious, taking in the busy scene around her. A few people glanced at her, wondering where her parents were, but she didn't look lost. She stood with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was supposed to be. The announcement came over the speaker. Flight 476 to Seattle is now boarding. First-class passengers and families with young children may now board. The little girl perked up. She clutched her backpack and walked toward the gate, her steps small but sure. The flight attendant scanned her ticket and smiled kindly. "Hello there, sweetheart. Are you flying alone today?" The girl nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am. My dad told me to wait for him on the plane." The attendant smiled again, a little surprised but trusting. "All right, honey. Seat 2A, let's get you comfortable." She led the girl down the jet bridge, chatting softly about how fun it was to fly. The girl listened politely, her eyes wide as they stepped onto the plane. She looked around the first-class cabin, with its large leather seats and quiet atmosphere. A few passengers were already seated. Business people, a couple on vacation, and an elderly woman knitting by the window. The girl climbed into her seat, her small legs dangling off the edge. She placed her teddy bear on her lap and buckled her seatbelt, just as she had been taught. Everything seemed fine, until a man seated across the aisle noticed her. He was in his late 40s, well-dressed in a gray suit, holding a laptop bag and a cup of coffee. His expression quickly changed from neutral to irritated. He leaned toward the flight attendant who was helping another passenger, and said in a low but sharp tone, "Excuse me. There must be a mistake. Why is there a child sitting in first class?" The attendant turned toward him, keeping her professional smile. "Sir, that's her assigned seat." The man frowned deeply. "That can't be right. I paid a premium for this seat. You're telling me a little girl gets to sit here alone?" His voice was growing louder, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. The attendant tried to stay calm. "Yes, sir. She's listed as a first-class passenger. Everything's in order." The man shook his head, clearly frustrated. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "What's happening to standards these days? First class is supposed to be for adults who actually earned it." The young girl turned her head slightly but said nothing. She looked at him for a moment, then quietly went back to holding her teddy bear. There was something about her calmness that made the man even more irritated. The attendant gave a polite smile and excused herself to help another traveler. The man sighed loudly, pulling out his laptop, clearly making sure everyone could see how inconvenienced he felt. As more passengers boarded, a few noticed the small girl sitting alone in the front row. Some smiled at her, others whispered softly to each other, wondering if she was traveling to visit her grandparents or maybe heading home from a trip. She smiled back when people smiled at her, but mostly she stayed quiet, her small hands folded in her lap. A woman seated behind her leaned forward and whispered to the man in the suit. "She's probably flying as an unaccompanied minor. Airlines do that sometimes." He glanced back at her, unimpressed. "Then she should be in economy with the rest of the kids. This is ridiculous. She's probably just someone's relative who pulled a few strings." The woman frowned at his harsh tone but decided not to argue. The young girl, though pretending to read the safety card, could clearly hear every word. Still, she said nothing. She just kept looking out the window, watching as the luggage was loaded into the cargo bay below. Minutes passed. The flight attendants began offering welcome drinks to the first-class passengers. When one reached the girl, she asked softly, "Would you like some orange juice, sweetheart?" The girl nodded. "Yes, please. Thank you." Her polite manners made the attendant smile again. "You're very well behaved. Are you visiting someone special?" The girl thought for a moment before answering. "I'm going home." The attendant nodded warmly. "That's nice. It's always good to go home." The man in the suit overheard and muttered under his breath, "Home, huh? Must be nice to get special treatment at that age." The girl ignored him. She took a small sip of her juice and held her teddy bear closer, like it was her best friend in the whole world. The boarding continued. The cabin filled with soft chatter, and the sound of luggage bins closing. The businessman checked his watch impatiently. "We're still waiting?" he asked another attendant, clearly irritated. "Yes, sir," the attendant said calmly. "The captain hasn't boarded yet," the man scoffed. "Great. Even the pilot's late." The little girl looked up for the first time since he started complaining. "My dad said he'd be right back," she said softly, almost as if reassuring herself. The man rolled his eyes. "Of course he did," he muttered. She didn't respond this time. She just smiled faintly as if she knew something he didn't. Around them, people settled into their seats. A mother helped her son with a tablet. A young couple exchanged photos of their last vacation. The attendants went through their final checks. The businessman typed away on his laptop, occasionally glancing at the girl as if trying to make sense of her presence. The plane doors were still open. A few flight attendants were quietly talking near the galley, waiting for the signal to close up. The girl sat peacefully, swinging her feet back and forth, humming a small tune under her breath. A passenger across the aisle smiled at her and said, "You must be very brave to fly alone." She looked at him politely. "I'm used to it," she said. "My dad flies a lot." "Oh, is he a businessman too?" the passenger asked kindly. The girl tilted her head and said with a little smile, "Something like that." The businessman overheard again and smirked. "Probably a travel agent or something," he whispered to himself, but loud enough for others to hear. No one replied this time. Even the nearby passengers were starting to grow uncomfortable with his attitude. The atmosphere in the cabin felt strange, calm but heavy with quiet judgment. Everyone was wondering the same thing. Who was this little girl really waiting for? And why did she seem so confident sitting alone in first class? Outside the window, the ground crew was finishing their final checks. The girl kept glancing toward the open door of the aircraft as if expecting someone any moment. Every time a uniformed person passed by, her face lit up slightly, then relaxed when it wasn't who she was waiting for. The businessman checked his watch again and muttered, "We're going to be late because of this nonsense." The flight attendant walked by and smiled at him politely, trying to ease the tension. "We'll be taking off soon, sir." "Just a few more minutes," he sighed loudly. "Let's hope so." The little girl didn't seem to hear him. She was focused on the door now, her small hands folded neatly, her teddy bear resting on her lap. The faintest smile appeared on her lips, like she could sense something about to happen. Then, just as the cabin lights dimmed slightly for departure, the sound of firm footsteps echoed from the jet bridge. A tall figure in a crisp pilot's uniform appeared at the door. The businessman barely looked up, still frowning at his laptop screen. The pilot spoke quietly with the attendants for a moment. Then his eyes moved toward the little girl sitting by the window. She looked up at him, her face breaking into a bright smile, the first real smile she'd shown since boarding. He smiled back and said softly, "There you are. I was wondering if you found your seat." Every head in the cabin turned toward them. The businessman froze mid-keystroke, realizing the pilot was talking to the little girl. The atmosphere shifted in an instant, but before anyone could say a word, the pilot reached out his hand and said gently, "Ready to fly, kiddo?" The girl nodded, still smiling. "Ready, Dad?" And just like that, the whispers stopped. For a few seconds, the cabin stayed silent. The man in the gray suit stared at the pilot, then at the little girl, then back again. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The other passengers looked surprised too. Some even smiled, realizing what was going on. The young girl wasn't just any passenger. She was the pilot's daughter. The pilot gave his daughter a gentle nod before turning to the flight attendants. "Everything ready?" he asked calmly. They nodded, smiling now that the tension had eased. He gave his daughter one last wink and said softly, "Behave, sweetheart. I'll see you after we land." "I will," she said quietly. As he disappeared back into the cockpit, the businessman shifted awkwardly in his seat. He looked out the window, trying to act as if nothing had happened, but his face had turned slightly red. The passengers nearby couldn't help but exchange glances. Some of them chuckled quietly. The flight attendants began closing the cabin doors and preparing for takeoff. The young girl sat proudly now, her small hands folded neatly on her lap. She looked peaceful again, as if the entire awkward scene hadn't happened at all. The man in the suit leaned back in his chair, but his mind was still spinning. He replayed the last few minutes in his head, feeling foolish for how he'd behaved. The child he had just criticized was the pilot's daughter, the same pilot who was now about to take them safely through the sky. He cleared his throat and tried to focus on his laptop again, but his thoughts wouldn't settle. Every time he glanced at the little girl, he saw the calmness in her eyes, and the quiet dignity he'd completely missed before. The engines roared softly as the plane began taxiing down the runway. The girl leaned toward the window, watching the lights blur past. She seemed completely fascinated by it, even though she had probably seen this view many times before. When the plane lifted off the ground, a few passengers clapped softly, as people sometimes do out of habit. The girl smiled and whispered to her teddy bear, "He always does a perfect takeoff." The man heard her but said nothing. Something about the way she said it made him feel even smaller. The attendants moved through the aisle after the seatbelt signs turned off. They offered drinks and snacks, their smiles genuine again after the earlier tension. When they reached the girl's seat, one of them crouched slightly and said, "You doing all right, sweetheart?" The girl nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." The attendant smiled. "Your dad's a wonderful pilot, you know." The girl's eyes lit up. "I know, he says flying makes him feel free." The attendant chuckled softly. "He's a good man. You must be proud of him." "I am," the girl said simply, sipping her orange juice. The businessman across the aisle watched the exchange quietly. He felt a strange heaviness in his chest, a mix of guilt and admiration. He had been so quick to judge her, to assume she didn't belong there. And now, watching her speak with such warmth and grace, he realized how wrong he had been. The rest of the passengers seemed more relaxed now. Some were reading, others dozing off. A few were watching movies on the seat screens. But the girl just kept looking out the window, her small face glowing in the soft cabin light. After some time, the man closed his laptop. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned slightly toward the girl. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently, not wanting to sound rude this time. She turned her head and smiled politely. "Yes, sir?" He took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have spoken the way I did earlier." "That wasn't fair." The girl blinked, surprised by his honesty. "It's okay," she said softly. "People don't know. It happens sometimes." Her answer stunned him. There was no anger, no resentment, just simple understanding. "You're very mature," he said quietly. She shrugged lightly. "My dad says people get upset when they don't understand something. He tells me not to take it personally." The man couldn't help but smile. "Your dad sounds like a smart man." She nodded proudly. "He is. He says flying teaches him patience. He says if you lose your cool in the sky, you lose control." The man leaned back, letting her words sink in. There was wisdom in them. Wisdom he hadn't expected from a 10-year-old. He looked out the window now, watching the clouds drift below. For the first time in a long while, he felt humbled. A while later, lunch was served. The attendants placed trays in front of the passengers, warm bread rolls, small salads, and steaming plates of chicken and rice. The girl carefully set her teddy bear on the seat beside her and unfolded her napkin like she had done it 100 times before. "You've flown with your dad before, haven't you?" the man asked, more curious now. She smiled. "Many times. When I was little, I used to cry when he left for work. So sometimes, if he had a short flight, he'd bring me along. He says it helps him concentrate knowing I'm close by." The man chuckled softly. "That's very sweet," the girl nodded. "He says flying is safer than driving. He always says, 'Don't worry, sweetheart. The sky takes care of us.'" Her voice was so calm and confident that even the man felt reassured by it. He hadn't realized until then how tense he'd been about flying. After the meal, the lights dimmed and the cabin grew quiet. Most of the passengers were either asleep or watching movies with their headphones on. The girl leaned back in her seat, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. She looked peaceful, her eyes slowly closing. The man sat quietly, thinking about his own family. He had a teenage son who barely spoke to him these days. They used to be close, but life had gotten busy. Work, meetings, travel, everything seemed more important at the time. He suddenly felt a pang of guilt for how distant he'd become. He looked at the little girl again. There was something pure about her faith in her father. It reminded him of the kind of love that didn't need proof, the kind that simply trusted. As the plane continued its smooth flight, the man reached into his bag and pulled out his phone. There was no signal, of course, but he opened a photo of his son anyway. It was from a few years ago. The two of them fishing by the lake, laughing at something that didn't matter now. He stared at it for a long time. The girl stirred slightly and opened her eyes. "Are we there yet?" she asked sleepily. "Not yet," he said kindly. "Still a bit to go." She smiled, half asleep. "I always fall asleep before we land." He smiled too. "That's probably the best way to fly." She nodded, already drifting off again. When the flight attendants came by to check on everyone, one of them gently covered the girl with a small blanket. She whispered to the man, "She's such a sweetheart, isn't she?" He nodded. "Yes, she really is." The hours passed quietly. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the clouds orange and pink. The man found himself just watching the view, something he never took time to do before. Normally, he'd be working or checking emails, but now he just sat there, feeling strangely peaceful. When the announcement came that they'd be landing soon, the girl woke up and stretched. She smiled at him and said, "See? I told you I always fall asleep." He chuckled softly. "You did." As the plane descended, the girl pressed her face against the window, watching the ground get closer. She pointed at the airport lights and said proudly, "Dad always lands so smoothly." "You'll see," the man smiled. "I'm sure he does." A few minutes later, the plane touched down so gently that half the passengers didn't even realize they'd landed. The cabin filled with light applause, and the girl beamed. "Told you," she said with a grin. He laughed softly. "You weren't kidding." When the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt signs turned off, the pilot's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Seattle. Thank you for flying with us today. We hope you had a pleasant journey." The man listened closely to the voice. It was calm, steady, and reassuring, just like his daughter's. For the first time, he understood where she got it from. As passengers began gathering their things, the man looked at the girl and said, "Hey, kiddo, tell your dad he's got one of the smoothest landings I've ever felt." She smiled brightly. "I will." He hesitated, then added softly, "And tell him he's got an amazing daughter, too." She giggled, her eyes full of warmth. "Thank you, sir." When the cockpit door opened, the pilot stepped out again, smiling at his daughter. She jumped up and gave him a quick hug. The passengers watched with gentle smiles, touched by the simple, beautiful moment between them. And for the man in the gray suit, something changed quietly inside him. He didn't say anything more, he didn't need to. He just smiled, realizing that sometimes a single flight can teach you more than 1,000 miles ever could. After the plane had landed and the passengers were allowed to unbuckle their seatbelts, the cabin slowly came to life. People began gathering their belongings, chatting quietly with those around them and stretching after the long flight. The young girl sat patiently, waiting for her father to finish his work in the cockpit. She hugged her teddy bear tightly, still smiling faintly from the hug she had just shared with him. The businessman in the gray suit, who had spent most of the flight silently reflecting, couldn't help but glance at her again. She looked so calm, so confident, and so unbothered by all the attention she had received earlier. Every time he saw her, he felt a little more embarrassed about how he had reacted. He had judged a child before knowing anything about her, and now it made him uncomfortable. He turned to look out the window, pretending not to watch, but he found himself observing the way she sat upright, straightening her small jacket as if she belonged there all along. Other passengers were curious too. A few whispered to each other, trying to piece together who she was. Some guessed she might be the child of someone rich, maybe a celebrity or a business executive. Others wondered if she was just an unaccompanied minor with special privileges. Nobody seemed to expect the truth. The young girl, however, wasn't thinking about what the passengers were whispering. She was focused on her father, waiting for him to come out of the cockpit. She knew he had a lot of responsibilities and that he had to make sure the plane was safely parked before joining her. She had learned patience from him. She had learned that important things take time, and there was no point in rushing. Finally, after what seemed like a few minutes but was probably just moments, the cockpit door opened. The pilot appeared, wearing the same calm, warm smile he always had. He looked around the cabin, and when his eyes found his daughter, they lit up. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. She nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, Dad. I can't wait." The passengers nearby couldn't help but smile. There was something about the interaction that felt genuine, natural, and comforting. The businessman noticed it too. He watched them for a moment, taking in how the father's presence seemed to make the girl glow with confidence and happiness. The pilot walked down the aisle with her small hand in his, gently guiding her as they made their way to the door. Along the way, a few passengers leaned forward, whispering to each other. "Is that the pilot?" one woman asked. "Yes," her companion whispered. "And that's his daughter. No wonder she was in first class." The businessman felt a wave of humility wash over him. He had been angry, complaining about her presence, thinking she didn't belong. And now he realized how wrong he had been. She hadn't demanded a special seat. She hadn't tried to show off. She had simply been where she belonged, quietly confident in her place. The flight attendants began preparing the cabin for disembarkation. They moved quickly but gently, helping passengers with their carry-on bags and offering assistance where needed. The little girl, guided by her father, walked carefully down the aisle, waving politely at the flight attendants as she passed. "Goodbye," she said sweetly. "Goodbye, sweetheart," they replied, smiling warmly. The businessman watched this exchange silently. There was no arrogance, no entitlement in her actions. Just kindness, politeness, and respect. He realized that he had let assumptions guide his behavior earlier. He had judged her based on her age and her size, thinking she didn't belong in first class. And he had been wrong. As they reached the exit of the plane, the pilot paused for a moment, looking back at the passengers. "Thank you for being patient today," he said in a calm, steady voice. "And thank you for trusting my daughter to enjoy this flight safely." There was a soft murmur of appreciation from the passengers. Some clapped gently, others just smiled. The businessman nodded quietly, feeling a strange sense of relief. He hadn't expected to feel moved, but something about the father and daughter had left an impression on him. Outside the plane, the airport was buzzing with activity. Ground crew were moving luggage, passengers were gathering to meet friends and family, and taxiing vehicles zipped back and forth. The pilot held his daughter's hand tightly as they stepped onto the tarmac, shielding her from the bustle around them. The little girl looked up at her father. "It was fun today," she said softly. "I'm glad," he replied, kneeling down to her level. "Did you enjoy being with everyone?" "Yes," she said with a bright smile. "Some people were very kind, others—" "Not so much," her father laughed gently. "That's life, sweetheart. People will always react differently. What matters is how you respond. And I'm proud of how you handled yourself." The girl hugged him tightly. "Thanks, Dad. I learned from the best." The businessman watched from a short distance, silently reflecting on his own actions. He had been rude, impatient, and judgmental. And yet he saw someone else, someone much younger, handle a similar situation with grace, patience, and understanding. He couldn't help but feel humbled. As they walked together toward the waiting car, the girl held her father's hand and looked up at him with complete trust. Passengers passing by watched the scene, some smiling quietly, some shaking their heads at how a simple moment could teach such an important lesson. The businessman thought about his own life. How many times had he judged someone before understanding their story? How many times had he let frustration guide his actions instead of patience? The small girl, barely 10 years old, had shown more maturity and understanding than he had in years. He watched as the pilot gently lifted the girl into the car, making sure she was comfortable before closing the door. Then he walked around, smiling and waving to the passengers, as if saying thank you for letting them be part of this small personal journey. Inside the terminal, passengers began gathering their luggage and heading toward the exits. The businessman lingered for a moment, thinking. He realized that sometimes life offers moments that are more than just chance encounters. Sometimes life teaches lessons quietly, through the actions of others, and often in ways we don't expect. He looked back one last time and saw the girl waving at the flight attendants from inside the car. Her smile was genuine, carefree, and full of warmth. And for a fleeting moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: humility, reflection, and a renewed sense of respect for the little things that make people extraordinary. As he finally turned to leave, he promised himself silently that he would remember this moment. He would remember how a young girl sitting quietly in a first-class seat had shown more composure, patience, and understanding than he had in a single morning. He would remember how her father, the pilot, had guided her with gentle strength, teaching lessons not only to his daughter but to everyone around them. The girl's laughter, carried softly from the car, stayed in his mind as he walked through the terminal. It was a reminder that life was full of unexpected lessons, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons came from the youngest voices. And as he passed through the gate, he felt a small shift inside him, a reminder that patience, humility, and kindness are never wasted, and that judging others before knowing their story can often leave us embarrassed and wiser, if only we are willing to notice. The plane had finally settled at the gate, and passengers began the slow process of standing, stretching, and collecting their belongings. The young girl sat quietly, her teddy bear still hugged in her arms, waiting for her father to step out of the cockpit. She had been calm and polite the entire flight, even when some passengers had whispered and stared at her, unsure of who she was. Now she waited with that quiet confidence that only comes from knowing you are in the right place, with the right person guiding you. The businessman in the gray suit remained seated, observing the little girl and her father's actions from across the aisle. He couldn't shake the lesson he had learned earlier, that he had judged too quickly, spoken too harshly, and made assumptions without knowing the truth. He felt a mix of embarrassment and admiration. The girl was calm, poised, and unbothered by his earlier complaints. Her composure was impressive, especially for someone so young. Passengers were shifting around, gathering coats, bags, and items from the overhead compartments. Some exchanged smiles and soft laughter about the small girl who had been sitting quietly in first class the entire flight. Others glanced curiously at the man who had caused a stir earlier, silently judging how sharply he had reacted. The air was full of quiet energy, a mixture of relief, curiosity, and fascination. Then, as the flight attendants began checking the aisles and making final announcements, the cockpit door opened. The pilot stepped out, walking confidently down the aisle. His uniform was crisp, his movements calm, and his expression warm. The moment he appeared, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Conversations paused, eyes turned toward him, and even the man in the gray suit felt a subtle tightening in his chest. The pilot's gaze immediately found his daughter, who looked up with a bright smile. "There you are," he said softly, kneeling slightly to greet her. "Ready to go home?" "Yes, Dad," she replied cheerfully, standing up and holding his hand as passengers looked on. The businessman's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He had expected a pilot to be busy, focused, and perhaps distant, but this gentle, warm interaction was something else entirely. The little girl's calm confidence and polite demeanor suddenly made perfect sense. She wasn't just any passenger. She was a child who had learned from the best. Other passengers whispered among themselves. "Is that the pilot?" one asked. "Looks like it," another replied. "And that's his daughter. No wonder she had that first-class seat." The businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that he had been completely wrong in his assumptions. He had thought the little girl was taking a seat she didn't deserve. Now he saw clearly that she belonged there, and that her father, the pilot, had ensured her comfort and safety all along. The pilot guided his daughter carefully toward the exit. She held her teddy bear in one hand and her father's hand in the other. Along the aisle, passengers smiled softly at the sight, some even leaning forward to watch the small but meaningful interaction. There was a sense of warmth in the cabin, a quiet understanding that life sometimes offers moments of surprise and humility. As they reached the front of the plane, the pilot paused, turning toward the passengers. "Thank you for your patience today," he said in his calm, steady voice. "And thank you for allowing my daughter to enjoy this flight safely. She is very special to me, and I appreciate your understanding." A soft murmur of appreciation ran through the cabin. Some passengers clapped gently. Others just smiled, feeling a sense of relief and admiration for both the pilot and his daughter. The businessman in the gray suit sat silently, his fingers tapping lightly on his briefcase. He felt a strange combination of embarrassment and awe, realizing that he had learned a lesson without even intending to. The young girl squeezed her father's hand and whispered, "Thank you for letting me fly with you today." He smiled down at her. "You've always been patient and brave, just like I told you to be." She grinned, her eyes shining. "I learned from the best." The businessman watched silently. He had spent the flight worrying about rules, fairness, and entitlement, but now he realized that what truly mattered was respect, patience, and understanding. The little girl had shown him more maturity than he had displayed in years. Passengers began disembarking, and the little girl stayed close to her father. She waved politely to the flight attendants, who smiled warmly in return. "Goodbye, everyone," she said softly. "Goodbye, sweetheart," the flight attendants replied. The man in the gray suit took a deep breath. He had been humbled. He realized that judging someone without knowing their story could lead to embarrassment and regret. He looked out the window at the bustling tarmac, thinking about how often he had made similar mistakes in his own life. The pilot guided his daughter carefully down the stairs to the waiting car outside the terminal. She glanced around, fascinated by the movement of people, luggage carts, and vehicles, but her focus remained on her father, the one person who had guided her through every step of the journey safely and calmly. "You did very well today," he said as they reached the car. "I'm proud of you." "I know," she said with a bright smile. "I always do my best," he chuckled softly. "Yes, you do. That's why you are my co-pilot in spirit, even if not in the cockpit." The passengers who were still watching could not help but smile. There was something pure and inspiring about this simple father-daughter connection. The businessman found himself studying the scene quietly, realizing that humility and patience were sometimes the most important lessons life could offer. He thought about his own family and the times he had been impatient or judgmental. Seeing the way the little girl and her father interacted, he felt a shift inside him. He had been too focused on minor inconveniences and appearances, missing the bigger picture of human kindness, respect, and patience. As the pilot lifted his daughter into the car, making sure she was comfortable and her seatbelt was fastened, he waved gently at the passengers. It was a quiet gesture, but it carried warmth, gratitude, and acknowledgement. Everyone watching felt the sincerity in that simple wave. The businessman in the gray suit finally exhaled. He knew he had been humbled and that he had learned something valuable. The little girl had shown him that appearances could be deceiving and that patience, kindness, and understanding were qualities that often went unnoticed, but left the strongest impression. Inside the terminal, other passengers began walking toward baggage claim, still whispering softly about the small girl who had been in first class. Some laughed quietly at the earlier scene with the businessman, who had complained about her seat. Others admired the pilot and his gentle parenting. Everyone had witnessed something meaningful, even if they didn't fully understand it. The little girl leaned against her father in the car, smiling faintly as the city lights reflected off the windows. She felt safe, happy, and proud. She had learned something from the journey. Too, that even when people reacted unfairly, it was possible to stay calm, kind, and confident. The businessman watched the car pull away, carrying both father and daughter. He realized that life sometimes offered these lessons quietly, through simple acts of connection, patience, and respect. He felt a gentle nudge to reflect on his own behavior, to think about the people he often judged too quickly, and to remember that understanding and humility were always more powerful than criticism and complaint. As the airport continued its usual chaos, the young girl and her father drove off, leaving behind a quiet, lingering impression on the passengers. It was a moment that many would remember, not because of a dramatic event, but because of the calm, natural display of kindness, confidence, and love. The businessman stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the lesson sink in. He realized that a small person, quiet and polite, had managed to teach him more about patience and respect than any meeting, seminar, or book ever had. And for that he felt grateful, even if it came with a small sting of embarrassment for his earlier behavior. The other passengers moved on, boarding connecting flights, hailing taxis, or walking toward buses. But in their minds, the image of the little girl with her teddy bear, holding her father's hand, remained. It was a quiet story of dignity, patience, and the unexpected ways people can teach one another important lessons. And for the businessman, the lesson was personal and unforgettable. He had been quick to judge and slow to understand, but he had been given a rare chance to witness humility, kindness, and poise in action. He knew he would carry that memory with him for a long time, a small but powerful reminder that everyone deserves patience and respect, no matter their age, size, or seat on a plane. The plane emptied completely, the cabin now silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. The little girl had gone, the pilot had gone, and the passengers had dispersed. But the lessons of the flight lingered in the minds of those who had watched closely, those who had witnessed the quiet courage of a small child, and the calm authority of a father guiding his daughter. And somewhere, inside the businessman's heart, he knew that he would never forget the day he learned to pause, reflect, and respect. All because of a young girl sitting in a first-class seat. The airport terminal was busy as usual, filled with the sounds of rolling suitcases, chatter, and announcements over the speakers. Passengers hurried past, eager to reach baggage claim, taxis, or waiting friends and family. But some of them lingered for a moment, still thinking about the small girl who had been seated in first class. She was quiet, polite, and confident, and her presence had changed the mood of the flight more than anyone had expected. The businessman in the gray suit sat on a bench near the boarding gates, his briefcase beside him. He had taken a moment to gather his thoughts, reflecting on the events of the flight. He had been quick to judge, loud in his complaints, and blind to the truth of the situation. Yet in the end, he had witnessed something extraordinary. A child handling herself with grace, patience, and confidence, and a father guiding her with kindness, warmth, and quiet authority. He remembered how he had scowled and whispered complaints, assuming she didn't belong in first class. Now he realized how foolish he had been. She hadn't demanded special treatment or tried to assert herself in any way. She had simply been where she belonged, calm and polite, and it had taken him the better part of the flight to recognize that. The little girl had shown him something he hadn't seen in years, that patience, kindness, and understanding often speak louder than words. She had not only endured the situation, but had done so gracefully without anger or complaint. And her father, the pilot, had guided her through it, teaching without saying much at all, letting her experience the world and encouraging her to remain composed. He glanced at the other passengers, many of whom were still murmuring to each other about what had happened. Some were discussing the way the pilot had smiled at his daughter and handled the situation so naturally. Others were laughing quietly, remembering the man who had complained so loudly and impatiently. There was a quiet sense of reflection in the air, as if the flight had taught everyone a small, subtle lesson about humility, judgment, and respect. The businessman thought about his own life. How many times had he judged someone too quickly? How many times had he allowed frustration to guide his behavior, thinking he knew better than others? He thought about his colleagues at work, the people he had passed by without understanding, the strangers he had dismissed too easily. And he realized that all of them deserved the same patience and understanding he had denied the little girl. He took a deep breath and opened his briefcase, pulling out a notebook he rarely used. For a long time he had focused only on work, meetings, and schedules. Now he began to write. He wrote about what had happened on the flight, the lesson he had learned, and the way the little girl had taught him more about grace and patience than any seminar or training session ever had. He wrote about the way her eyes had remained calm even when people whispered and stared, about the quiet confidence that had shone through her small frame, and about the warm guidance of her father. Writing made him reflect even more. He realized that life often gives these small moments of teaching in ways we don't expect. A child polite and patient can sometimes be the greatest teacher. A parent, guiding quietly from the background, can show more wisdom than someone who tries to control everything openly. The little girl and her father had done just that, teaching lessons without demanding attention, without seeking recognition. Meanwhile, other passengers were moving toward the exits. A woman who had been seated near the little girl approached the businessman. "That child was amazing, wasn't she?" she asked softly. He nodded. "She really was. And her father, he's remarkable too." The way he guided her quietly without making a fuss, it was inspiring. The woman smiled. "I was watching them the whole flight. You could see how comfortable she was, how confident. And yet she was just a kid." He nodded again, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude. "I've learned more from her today than I have in a long time. It's a lesson I won't forget." The woman looked at him kindly. "It's amazing how children can teach us without even trying. Sometimes all they need is guidance and patience." He smiled, finally feeling a sense of peace. For the first time in hours, he felt calm, reflective, and grateful. The experience had humbled him, but in a good way. He realized that life's lessons often come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes they come with no words at all, only actions, small gestures, and quiet confidence. As he stood to leave the terminal, he caught one last glimpse of the little girl and her father outside. The pilot was helping her into the car, ensuring her seatbelt was fastened properly and giving her a reassuring smile. She was smiling back, holding her teddy bear and her father's hand. It was a simple moment, but it carried so much meaning: love, trust, patience, and understanding. The businessman felt a pang of longing, thinking about his own family. He thought of his son, who was now older and more distant, and he realized how important it was to spend time teaching, guiding, and listening, not just to scold or judge. The little girl had reminded him of something he had forgotten: that patience and understanding can shape people far more than criticism or complaints ever can. He walked slowly toward the exit, feeling a small shift inside him. Something had changed quietly but significantly. He had been reminded that humility is not a weakness, that respect is not a choice but a responsibility, and that even small actions can leave lasting impressions. Outside, the city lights reflected off the airport windows, casting a warm glow. The little girl waved one last time to the flight attendants as the car pulled away. The passengers who had stayed behind watched silently, feeling a quiet satisfaction. They had witnessed something special, a moment of genuine human connection that went beyond age, status, or seating arrangements. The businessman took a deep breath and looked up at the night sky. He thought about the clouds they had flown above, the smooth landing, and the small moments that had made the flight memorable. The little girl's smile, her calmness, and her gentle confidence were etched in his mind. The lesson was clear. Sometimes people teach without trying, and humility often comes from observing rather than speaking. He felt a sense of gratitude for having been present for that lesson. He had begun the day irritated, judgmental, and impatient. Now he was reflective, humble, and more aware of his own actions. The little girl had shown him that patience and grace can come in the smallest of packages, and her father had shown that guidance and love can create confidence that shines through, even in challenging situations. As he walked toward the taxi line, he thought about how he could apply this lesson in his life. He decided he would be more patient with people he didn't understand, more generous with trust, and more willing to observe before judging. He realized that respect and humility are not just lessons for children, they are lessons for everyone. Meanwhile, the little girl and her father were driving home. She leaned back in her seat, her teddy bear tucked in her lap, smiling quietly. She had learned that patience and calmness could carry her through challenging situations, and that trust in her father would always guide her safely. Her father glanced at her occasionally, smiling, knowing that she had handled herself with poise and grace during the flight. He felt proud, not because of the seat she had been assigned or the passengers' reactions, but because she had grown through the experience, demonstrating confidence, patience, and understanding. The father thought about how often life tests us with small challenges, how people judge quickly, and how lessons can come from unexpected places. He realized that teaching through example, showing patience, love, and guidance, is far more effective than words alone. His daughter had experienced a small but meaningful lesson, and he knew it would shape the way she responded to situations in the future. The journey back home was quiet and peaceful. The little girl looked out the window, watching the city lights pass by, thinking about the flight. She remembered the whispers, the stares, and the complaints, but she also remembered the smiles, the kind words, and the gentle encouragement of her father. She understood that not everyone would react with understanding, but that it was possible to remain calm, polite, and confident in every situation. The businessman, meanwhile, had reached his own home. He sat quietly, reflecting on the flight. The experience had humbled him, reminding him that assumptions can mislead, that patience is powerful, and that small people often carry the biggest lessons. He thought about the little girl, her calm demeanor, and the gentle guidance of her father. The memory stayed with him, a reminder that life often teaches its lessons in the simplest, most human ways. Days later, he would recall the flight in his mind, remembering how quickly judgment had been replaced with humility, irritation with reflection, and complaint with understanding. He would think about the little girl, her polite demeanor, her quiet confidence, and the father who guided her with patience and love. It would remind him to slow down, to observe before judging, and to treat every interaction with care and respect. The lesson of the flight was simple yet profound. Life often presents moments that teach us about patience, kindness, and humility. The small actions of one child and the quiet guidance of a parent can leave impressions that last far longer than words, lectures, or scoldings. The little girl had flown with confidence, handled herself with grace, and reminded everyone around her, especially those who had been quick to judge, that respect and patience are qualities worth practicing every day. And so, the flight ended not just as a journey from one city to another, but as a lesson in humanity. A lesson in how small gestures, quiet confidence, and patient guidance can change perspectives, inspire reflection, and teach humility. The little girl and her father had done more than just complete a flight safely. They had reminded everyone on board that the smallest people often carry the greatest lessons, and that patience, kindness, and respect are always worth practicing. The businessman never forgot that day. He remembered the calm eyes of the young girl, the gentle smile of the pilot, and the quiet strength they both carried. It was a lesson he would carry with him forever, a reminder that understanding comes before judgment, and that sometimes the most important lessons are learned from those who seem too small to teach them. And in the quiet moments, long after the plane had landed, the passengers who witnessed the flight would remember the little girl in first class. Her courage, her patience, and her ability to remain composed in the face of unfairness. They would recall the pilot who guided her with gentle authority, teaching a lesson of love, respect, and calm wisdom. Together, they had turned a simple flight into a story of human connection, reflection, and growth that would stay with everyone on board for a long time.